My name is Diana, and the story I'm about to tell you, the family never wanted it told. The night June Whitfield left the house on Cartwright Road, she took 2 bags and a box of architecture textbooks and her grandmother's pearl earrings, which had been left to her specifically, and which she was not going to leave behind regardless of what else happened that evening. She was 22 years old. It was February 2000, which was a hot, dry Melbourne summer that she still associates with the particular quality of leaving, not the dramatic leaving of someone who has been pushed to the edge in a single catastrophic moment, but the quieter, more deliberate leaving of someone who has been standing at a door for a long time and has finally understood that the door is not going to open from the other side. Her mother Frances stood in the hallway while June carried her things to the car. Her brother Martin stood in the kitchen doorway and did not offer to help. He had his girlfriend Tracy with him. They had been together 8 months, long enough for Tracy to have a habitual quality in the house, long enough for Martin to have started speaking about the spare room, June's room, in the tone of someone who considers a problem already solved. The argument that preceded June's departure had been about the room in the way that arguments are often about rooms when they are really about something else, about who the family's future belonged to, about whose version of the next 10 years was the one everyone else was required to accommodate. Martin wanted June's room for Tracy. June had refused. This was on the surface, the argument. Underneath it was a longer argument about architecture school, which Martin thought was impractical, and which Frances had been carefully not defending for 2 years while Martin's opinion grew louder. Underneath that was the longest argument of all, which was about who June was allowed to be inside a family that had a specific idea of how its members were supposed to arrange their lives, and what happened when one of those members arranged hers differently. She loaded the car. Frances stood in the hallway. Martin stayed in the kitchen doorway. No one helped. She drove away at 9:15 and she did not drive back. She would like you to understand one thing about that night before the story moves forward, because it matters to how everything else reads. She was not certain she was right. She had refused the room. She had held the line against Martin's certainty. She had watched Frances choose the line of least resistance and had felt, not anger exactly, which would have been simpler, but something more complex, the specific ache of loving someone who does not love you back at full capacity, who loves you in a diluted form, because the undiluted form requires a confrontation they cannot manage. She was not certain Martin was wrong in a simple moral sense. She was certain that the version of June's life he had approved of was not the version June was going to live, and that the room and architecture school and the February evening were all part of the same decision, which was the decision about whether she was going to build herself into the shape someone else's vision required or into the shape her own work would make. She chose the second thing. She is still choosing it 6 years later, every morning when she goes to work at the company she built. The certainty came later. That night she was 22 and tired and driving to Fitzroy. The certainty came from the work. It always does. She has thought about that drive many times since. February in Melbourne has that particular end-of-summer quality, the heat that has gone on long enough to lose its novelty, the light falling later and harder. She drove with the 2 bags in the back seat and the box of textbooks on the passenger floor, and she did not cry. She was surprised by this at the time. She had expected to cry and she didn't, and she has come to understand in the years since that the absence of tears was not a failure of emotion, but a sign of how long the leaving had already been happening inside her. You don't cry when the thing finally happens, if the thing has been happening for a long time already. The grief had been distributed across 2 years of arguments and silences and Frances's careful half-agreements, and by the time she pulled out of the driveway, there was nothing left to release. She drove to Priya's in Fitzroy and knocked at 10:30, and Priya opened the door and said, "I thought this might happen." She did not ask for an explanation. She said, "Come in," and June came in, and they sat in the kitchen, and Priya made tea, and June told her, concisely, what had occurred. Priya offered the sunroom until they sorted something properly. June slept there for 6 weeks on a camp stretcher and then moved into the back bedroom when the housemate left. Priya had grown up in a family that did not fully understand her choices either. Her parents had wanted medicine, not design, and she carried their quiet disappointment with the specific efficiency of a person who has decided not to let it cost her time. They were well matched in that particular way, 2 women building things that no one in their families of origin had a vocabulary for in a city that had enough space for what they were building if they were willing to do the work of building it. They were willing. That was the distinguishing fact about both of them, and it was the fact that everything else followed from. She needs you to understand what Martin's objection to architecture school was, because the surface version doesn't carry the full weight of what it meant. Martin had left school at 17 and gone into the building trade, working for a family friend who ran a small construction business in the outer eastern suburbs. He had been competent and then good, and then the kind of reliable that builds a reputation in a specific trade world, and he had eventually moved from labor into the administrative side of the business and then out of the business entirely to start his own enterprise, which was the hardware supply company he opened in 2008. He was not uneducated in the way people mean when they use that word as an insult. He had built the hardware business with real work. June was honest about this and had always been honest about it. She did not despise Martin. She had never despised him, even in the worst versions of February 2000, even in the kitchen doorway. She had understood, even then, that what he was not malicious but limited, a person who had found a framework that worked for him and had applied it to everyone in his radius without checking whether it fit. The framework said practical things are the right things, and impractical people eventually fail and come back to the practical ones, and the smart move is to wait for that to happen. He had held that framework against her for 2 years, and she had refused to fail on his schedule, and eventually the framework had nothing left to apply itself to, because she was no longer in the radius. That was the shape of it. Not villainy, not cruelty. A framework too narrow for the specific person it was applied to, and a mother who could not quite bring herself to push back against it, and a 22-year-old woman who loaded her car and drove to Fitzroy and never quite came back. She held all of this carefully. She was not interested in a version of the story that made Martin a monster, because the monster version would be inaccurate, and inaccuracy was something she had no patience for, even when the accurate version was less satisfying. He understood his world with the particular intelligence of someone who had built that understanding through experience, rather than formal instruction, and there was nothing wrong with that understanding on its own terms. The problem was the way he applied it to June, because June was going to university, had fought for university against Francis's gentle ambivalence and Martin's more direct skepticism. And the university she was going to was the Melbourne School of Design, which was not a degree Martin had a framework for, and which he had filed in a category he called impractical. He had a specific definition of practical, which meant it produced income within 2 years, it involved a trade with clear market demand, it built something you could point to. Architecture, in his assessment, did not qualify. Architecture was a degree for people who had money to spare on an education that might never pay back. He said this, or versions of it, at irregular intervals over the 2 years June was in her program. Francis did not say it. Francis was not unkind, but Francis had a specific quality that June has spent years trying to describe precisely. She was a woman who believed, genuinely and without malice, that the person with the strongest opinion was probably right, not because she was weak, because she had spent her life in environments where strong opinions were held by the people who usually did turn out to be right. Martin had always been confident. Martin had done well. Martin had the confidence of the right, and it read as authority. So Francis did not defend architecture school. She listened to Martin, and she half agreed with him in the way she half agreed with most things he said, and then she was careful not to volunteer opposition when June was in the room. June saw this. She was 20 and 21, and she saw it with the specific clarity of a person who is being set aside by a family that doesn't quite know it's doing it, and who understands already that the door is not going to open from that side. She finished her first year. She came home that summer, and Martin had Tracy there, and the house had shifted in the way houses shift when a new center of gravity appears, and the shift had moved June further toward the edge. She went back to Melbourne in February, and she did not argue about architecture school that summer. She simply went. She was getting better at understanding which arguments were worth having and which ones were already over before they started. Francis called twice in the first year after February 2000. Both calls were careful and short, the calls of two people navigating a space that had not been mapped. Francis said she hoped June was well. She said Martin was good. She said Tracy had moved into the spare room and it had worked out nicely. She did not say come back. She did not say we were wrong. She said I hope you're well, June, and the call ended. June was, in fact, well. She had moved into a shared house in Fitzroy with 2 other architecture students. a woman named Priya, and a man named Declan, who would eventually become her closest professional collaborator, and she had completed her degree in 2002, which was the year she also held 3 part-time jobs and slept, by her own calculation, an average of 5 hours a night for 11 months. She had graduated with first-class honors and had been offered a graduate position at a mid-sized Melbourne practice within 6 weeks of finishing, and she had taken it, and she had learned. The 8 years at the practice were not glamorous in the external sense and were, in the internal sense, the most formative period of her professional life. She learned, in that time, the specific texture of what it meant to be responsible for a thing from inception through completion, the particular accountability of an architect, who is also a project manager, who is also, inevitably, the person who has to make the call when the structural engineer and the building contractor are in direct disagreement at 7 in the morning on a day when the concrete pour cannot be rescheduled. She made those calls. She got them right more often than not. The ones she got wrong she learned from with the specific attention of someone for whom being wrong is information rather than defeat. She left at 31 because she was ready to, and because Priya was ready, and because the business they had been sketching on the margins of other work for 2 years was now substantial enough that staying inside someone else's structure felt like a constraint they had both outgrown. Leaving was a risk. Neither of them had children or partners who depended on their salary, which made the risk a different kind of risk than it might otherwise have been, the kind you carry yourself, with no cushion and no net, but also with no one else's livelihood tied to the outcome. They had been careful, and they had been smart, and they had been, when it mattered, willing to work at a pace that Declan, who had gone a different direction professionally and who they occasionally saw for dinner, once described as incompatible with having a body. They had not found this funny at the time. Afterward, she had always been, even by the standards of people who are good at learning, exceptionally fast at it. Not at everything. At the specific things that architecture requires: spatial reasoning, structural logic, the ability to hold a complex 3-dimensional system in her mind and rotate it and identify where the stress points were and what would need to change for the whole to hold. Her thesis supervisor, a careful, rigorous woman who had been practicing for 30 years and who did not use superlatives, had used the word exceptional in writing twice, in contexts where it was not required and was therefore meaningful. She had spent 8 years at the practice, moved twice in that time to roles of increasing responsibility, and at 31 she had left salaried employment and begun the thing that would eventually become Whitfield and Park Property Development. The name combined her surname and Priya's, and the combination was deliberate and considered. They were equal partners in a business they had built together from a rented desk in a shared workspace in Collingwood, and the name was the business card version of that equality. The company had started with residential renovations and small commercial projects, the unglamorous foundation of any property business, the work that teaches you what you're made of before the interesting problems arrive. It had grown, slowly and in the specific way that companies grow when they are built by people who understand what they are doing and don't need to appear larger than they are before they actually are. By 2010, it had 20 employees and a portfolio of 8 commercial properties. By 2015, 30 employees and 15 properties across inner Melbourne and the near suburbs. By 2020, 60 employees, 3 states, a balance sheet that would have been difficult to explain to Martin at the kitchen table in 2000, and which she had never tried to explain to him, because there had been no contact through which to try. The house on Cartwright Road had been sold in 2011. June had learned about the sale through a property listing database, which was how she learned most things about the family's material circumstances. She saw the listing appear in a search result, recognized the address, and sat with the knowledge of it for a day before filing it in the mental category she kept for information that was true and not actionable. Frances had moved into a smaller place in Hawthorne. Martin and Tracy were in the larger house now. Tracy had become Tracy Whitfield in 2004, and they had 2 children, and Martin's hardware business had opened in 2008 and moved to larger premises in 2014. June knew these things in the fragmented, peripheral way you know the outline of a life you're no longer inside, occasional data points surfacing through professional databases or mutual connections, enough to know the shape of things without the texture. Martin had opened his business in the outer eastern suburbs because he knew the territory. His network was there, his customer base was there. The hardware and building supplies trade runs on relationships and local knowledge, and Martin had both, and the business had done well, steadily rather than spectacularly, the kind of performance that builds a solid livelihood without the volatility that accompanies faster growth. In 2014, he had moved to larger commercial premises on a main road to accommodate the trade account growth. The building was a 2-story commercial property with a loading dock and rear yard access, practical for the hardware trade. He had signed a 5-year lease with a property management company at 2014 market rates and had operated there since. He did not know, when he signed the lease, who ultimately owned the building. June did not know, when she acquired the building as part of a portfolio transaction in 2016, who was leasing it. The transaction had been a block acquisition, 14 commercial properties in the eastern suburbs, purchased from a retiring landlord whose portfolio had been assembled over 30 years. June and Priya had reviewed the portfolio for 3 months before making the offer, and they had been thorough. But the tenants of each property were recorded in the due diligence documentation as business names and trade categories. The hardware and building supplies tenant in the Croydon property was listed as Whitfield Building Supplies. June had read those words in a document during due diligence and had registered Whitfield as a common surname, a coincidence, and had continued to the next line. She did not discover it was Martin until 2019. Her property manager flagged the Croydon lease for renewal review and sent the tenant contact details, and the contact was listed as Martin Whitfield with a mobile number. She recognized the same number she had found occasionally in her phone contacts over 20 years. Never called, never deleted. She looked at that number for a long time. She sat with what she knew for 2 weeks before deciding what to do. She is not a person who makes decisions from the first position. She has learned that the first position is usually the most reactive one and that the more interesting and accurate position is usually the third or fourth. So she waited and she worked and she came home in the evenings and sat on the deck of her house in Northcote and thought about it. The deck in Northcote looked west, and in October the sunsets came in long horizontal bands across the sky, and she had sat out there through enough of them to know the particular quality of light that arrived around 7:30, the specific amber that made the neighbors' rooftops look warmer than they were, that made the city feel, briefly, like a place that had organized itself with deliberate beauty rather than accumulating at random. She liked this light. She had chosen the house partly for what the deck saw, which was something a property developer would notice and which a 22-year-old woman in Fitzroy with a camp stretcher and 3 part-time jobs would not have imagined noticing. She thought about Martin in those evenings in a specific and organized way. She was not, and has never been, interested in cruelty. She has met people who carry the desire to make others feel what they felt, and she understands the desire, but she has never been able to give it room. Cruelty requires an investment of attention in the other person's suffering that she has never wanted to make. What she was interested in, sitting on the deck with the amber light, was accuracy. She wanted to know what she was actually going to do and why she was going to do it, and she wanted those reasons to be real. The business reason was real. Market rate was market rate. It was the rate she charged every other tenant in the portfolio. Subsidizing Martin with a below-market rate would have been a business decision made for personal reasons, and she did not do that, not with Martin, not with anyone. This was her work, and she did it cleanly. The personal reason was also real, and she sat with it honestly. She wanted to see him. She wanted to be in the room when the pieces assembled into the picture they would assemble into. She did not want to engineer his discomfort. She wanted to see his face when he understood what had been true for 3 years, what had been true without either of them knowing it, what had been true because of the specific way her life had moved through the world without his having any part in it. She wanted him to see that. She thought it was something he needed to see, not for her sake, but for the accuracy of his understanding of what 26 years had produced. She called her solicitor on a Monday morning and asked to schedule the meeting. She thought about Martin at 19, standing in the kitchen doorway in the same building trade clothes he had always worn, certain that he was the one who understood the world correctly. She thought about Francis in the hallway, hands clasped, not quite asking June to stay, not quite endorsing the situation, holding her characteristic position of half agreement with the person who sounded most assured. She thought about what she had built in 26 years without any of their input or encouragement or understanding. She thought about the 5-hour nights in Fitzroy and the 3 jobs and the first-class honors and the 8 years at the practice and the 31-year-old woman sitting across from Priya at a kitchen table in Collingwood saying, "Let's start something." She thought about all of it and she tried to arrive, honestly at the question of what she wanted to do with the lease. The business answer was clean. She renewed leases at market terms. The eastern suburbs commercial market had moved significantly since 2014. A market rate renewal would increase Martin's costs by an amount her property manager had quantified as material. This was not punishment. It was the rate every other tenant was paying. It was the rate she was entitled to charge, and it was the rate she intended to charge. The personal answer was less clean. She was honest about this when she finally told me. She said, "I didn't go into that room to hurt him. But I knew it would be hard, and I didn't try to make it easier than it needed to be." She asked her solicitor to be present. She asked Grace, her property manager, to attend. She asked for the meeting to be formatted as a formal lease negotiation, which it was, fully and correctly, and she asked that her name appear, without explanation or advance notice, in the meeting paperwork as the property owner. Martin arrived at the solicitor's office at 9:05 on a Thursday morning in October 2019. June had arrived at 8:45. She had sat in the meeting room with a coffee and the lease renewal folder and the comparable market analysis, and she had gone through each item one more time. Not because she needed to, but because it was what she did before any significant meeting. She returned to the material, confirmed she had everything she needed, and arrived in the room as someone who was fully prepared. David, her solicitor, arrived at 8:50. Grace arrived at 8:55. The three of them had a brief conversation about format, who would speak to what, the sequence of the agenda items, and then there was a few minutes of quiet. June looked at the window. The street below was doing its ordinary Thursday morning things. She thought briefly about February 2000 and the drive to Fitzroy, and then she put it away, because she needed her full attention for the meeting, and the meeting was what she had come for. He walked into the meeting room with his accountant mid-sentence about the car park rates nearby, and he turned toward the table and saw June. She has described the moment with precision, because precision is how she describes most things. She said. He stopped. Everything he was in the middle of the sentence, the forward motion, the posture of a man arriving at a routine business meeting, stopped. His accountant said something. He didn't answer. Then he sat down. June said, "Hello, Martin." He said, "June." She said, "Sit down. We have a lot to cover." What followed was, in its formal structure, a lease negotiation. June had the comparables. She had the market analysis, she had the renewal terms and the justification for each of them presented in the same ordered and complete way. She presented everything. Her solicitor covered the legal framework. Grace covered the property management details. Martin's accountant asked the questions a good accountant asks and received clear answers. Martin was quiet through most of it. He asked 2 questions, both practical, both about the transition costs associated with the rate increase. She answered them directly and without softening. The terms were market terms. The justification was the market data. There was nothing to argue with, and he did not try to argue. At the end of the meeting, when the terms had been agreed and the papers were being assembled, Martin said, "I didn't know." June said, "I know." He said, "How long have you owned it?" Said, "Since 2016. He said, 3 years. She said, "Yes." He looked at the table for a moment. Then he said, "Why didn't you say something?" She said, "I'm saying something now." She closed her folder. She stood. She said it was good to see him, and she meant it. Not in the warm sense, not in the sense that things were resolved, or that the gap was filled, or that February 2000 had been retroactively made into something other than what it was. She meant it in the plain sense she had seen him. He was alive and functioning, and his business had continued. That was a fact, and she acknowledged it. She shook hands with the accountant, and she walked out. She walked out through the lobby and down the lift and onto the street, and she stood on the pavement in the October morning, and she waited. She had expected something when she planned the meeting, had expected to feel, afterward, the specific quality of closure that you imagine will accompany a long-deferred reckoning. She had been careful not to want that too much, because she knew from experience that things rarely feel the way you imagine they will feel, and that the gap between the imagined feeling and the actual feeling is where most of the grief lives. What she actually felt, standing on the pavement on a Thursday morning in October, was something quieter, not closure, not satisfaction, something more like the feeling of putting down a weight she hadn't realized she was still carrying, not dramatically, not with relief, but simply the weight was there, and now it was not, and the not having it felt different from the having it in a way that would take her a while to map. She walked to the nearest coffee shop. She ordered coffee. She sat at a window seat and looked at the street, and she thought about Martin's face when he walked through the door and saw her. The specific stop, the sentence halted, the forward motion ceased. She thought about it, not with triumph, but with something more complicated, the recognition that she had, for the first time in 26 years, been fully visible to him. He had seen her in the room where the lease was being negotiated as exactly what she was, VP of the company that owned his building, proprietor of the portfolio that included the 4 walls his business functioned inside, the impractical one, in the room, holding the lease. She thought, I built this? I built it without any of them. And they didn't need to know that for it to be true. They just needed to know it now. She finished her coffee. She called Priya, she said. It happened. Priya said, I know, you texted. How was it? June said it was a meeting. It was a very good meeting. She could hear Priya's specific quiet laugh over the phone, the one that meant, I see you exactly. She said, good. Do you want to grab lunch? June said, yes, and they did. Francis called her 3 weeks later. It was the first call in 8 years. Francis said, Martin told me about the meeting. June said, I thought he might. Francis said, why didn't you come back? All these years. June said carefully, without accusation, with the specific precision she applied to the things that mattered most to her because no one asked me to. Francis was quiet. The silence on the phone had a quality that June has described as the silence of someone who has arrived at 71 years old at a door they should have opened decades earlier and is only now deciding whether to push. Francis said, I should have asked. June said, yes. She did not say, it's all right. It was not all right, and saying so would have been the kind of untruth that closes a conversation down rather than opening it. What she said instead was, I'm glad you're calling now. And then she waited to see what Francis would do with the space. What Francis did was talk, haltingly and with the specific difficulty of someone who is not practiced at naming things directly, about the February evening, about standing in the hallway, about the specific thing she had not done, which was to say stay. June listened without interrupting. She did not offer absolution. She did not perform forgiveness. She listened, which was the thing Francis needed, and which cost June something, the energy of being present with someone who had hurt you by absence, of giving your full attention to their account of the thing they hadn't done. At the end of the call, Francis said, Can I call again? June said, yes. She put the phone down after that call and sat in her kitchen for a while. The conversation had taken 40 minutes, which was 40 minutes more than she had spoken to Francis in 8 years, and the accumulation of those years was not something she expected to resolve in one phone call. She did not expect to resolve it at all, in the sense of arriving at a place where the past is made retroactively different. The past was what it was. Francis in the hallway, not saying stay. Martin in the kitchen doorway, not moving to help. 9:15 on a February evening, the car loaded, the decision made for her. What she expected and what she has, carefully and with realistic expectations, been building since was something more limited, a present tense relationship with a person she had once known well, starting from where they actually were rather than from where they should have been. She had done harder construction than this. She would do this too. She called Francis back 3 weeks later. They talked about Hawthorne, about Francis's garden, about a problem with the guttering that Francis had been managing alone. June listened. She offered when it was useful, the specific competence she had. She knew builders. She knew what guttering replacement should cost. She could make a call. Francis said, I don't want to trouble you. June said, it isn't trouble. It's what I do. It was a small thing. She knows it was a small thing, but it was the first time in 26 years that June had been able to give her mother something from the place she had built, and she gave it without ceremony and without keeping score. Martin renewed the lease. His business is still there paying market rent, managed through Grace's office in the same professional way it was managed before either of them knew who the landlord was. There are no dinners. There are occasional exchanges through the property management layer, a maintenance question, a loading dock issue resolved without incident. June handles these the way she handles all tenant matters promptly, completely, without extra warmth and without extra distance. She had wondered, in the months after the lease was signed, whether she should have done something different, given him a discount she wasn't entitled to give, given him the information earlier, given him the 3 years of being the anonymous landlord rather than the confrontation of the meeting room. She has gone through these alternatives and she has concluded, each time, that they are not alternatives she could have lived inside. She is not built for that kind of management of other people's comfort. She builds things and she does them cleanly and she lets the results speak, and the result here, a market-rate lease with a tenant who now knows who the landlord is the clean result. Everything else would have required her to be a different person, and she is not interested in being a different person. She has spent 26 years becoming exactly who she is. Frances sends a card at Christmas. June sends one back. It has been 5 years since the phone call, and the relationship has settled into something careful and genuine. Not what it might have been if February 2000 had gone differently, but not nothing. They speak occasionally, briefly, in the way of two people who are relearning a language they let lapse for too long and are discovering that some of the vocabulary has not survived. June does not begrudge this. She has made her peace with the timeline and with the people who shaped it. Martin did what he did, and Frances did what she did, and June left and built what she built. And all of those things are true simultaneously, and the truth of each one does not cancel the others. What she holds still, what she has not put down and does not expect to, is the specific cost of those 26 years, not the career years which she used completely. Not the professional years, which were rich and full and which produced things she is genuinely proud of. What she holds is something smaller, the particular gap that opens in a person's life when the family who should have seen them first chose not to look, and what grows in the gap instead of what might have grown if the looking had happened on time. Something grows. She is evidence of that. But the shape of it is different than it would have been. She thinks about this specifically when she is in the eastern suburbs for site visits and drives through the territory Martin has inhabited all his life. The streets he grew up on, the streets his business serves. She did not grow up to inhabit that territory. She grew in a different direction, toward the inner suburbs and then cityward, and then outward in the specific pattern of a property portfolio that follows its own logic. She has offices in the CBD and sites in 3 states. She knows the Melbourne development landscape the way Martin knows the eastern suburbs building trade through years of granular attention to the specific texture of how things work and what they require. These are both real forms of knowledge. They do not overlap. They were never going to overlap, and the February evening 26 years ago, the one that looked like an ending, was probably also the beginning of the specific shape her knowledge would take, the shape of someone building in a particular direction because another direction was closed. She does not know whether to call this a gift or a cost. She suspects, on balance, that it is both, which is where most true things land when you look at them long enough. She has spent 26 years building in the specific posture of someone who is working without a net, and the posture stays in the body even when the net appears. She cannot fully undo the shape that independence made in her. She does not, on balance, regret it. She is a careful and honest woman, and she says, "I don't regret what I became. I grieve what we could have had." Both of those are true. There is a question this story carries that I cannot answer for you, but which I think you should sit with. When you hold the door to your family open, when you are the one who keeps reaching back across the gap, how long do you hold it before you close it quietly and go on? How do you know when patience has become its own kind of self-erasure? And what do you do with the people who finally come looking? 26 years on, when the you they find is not the one they turned away. June closed the door in February 2000. She did not lock it. She left the key in the other side. It took 26 years, a portfolio acquisition, and a lease renewal before anyone used it. She is still deciding what she thinks about that. She may always be. If you've lived something like this, you don't have to explain it to anyone. But if you want to, I'm here. I'm Diana.